we have Caitlyn Ranieri and Mark Thomas-Patterson.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so hello, my name is Caitlyn Ranieri. I'm a junior at Indiana University, and today I will be discussing a shift in reunification sentiment solely in South Korea, though in my paper I did touch on North Korea, but the primary chunk of it is South Korea. So today I will discuss my methodology, my analysis, the significance of my research, a very brief history of what I'm going to be talking about, and then my findings throughout my research process. So firstly, my methodology, I utilize the KINU, or the Korean Institute for National Unification, Reunification survey data. This data was taken from April 5th to the 25th of 2019. Respondents were at least 19 years old or older. I analyzed the shifts in rhetoric given current events, so typically from 2016 to the present. Also, I researched recorded interviews from South Koreans' perspective on reunification, as well as newspaper rhetoric. So in my analysis, I wanted to emphasize that these surveys and these opinion polls are a means in which we can capture and observe this shift in how South Koreans are perceiving reunification, the reality of it, the lack in reality of it. And then the significance of this research is reunification, while it is still a dream of South Korea's, is no longer a possible reality in terms of the minds of South Koreans as years go by, as it has really been in the past, especially given South Korea's current economy and the trajectory of it. Reunification seems increasingly more distant from reality. So given the history, July 27th, 1953 brought with it the end of the Korean War, which started in 1950, as well as a strong desire for reunification. As soon as the war was over, talks about what was going to happen on the peninsula was kind of like a tidal wave. But in recent years, a change has kind of been lurking in newspaper rhetoric in people's minds. And that question is reunification still necessary? Is it still something that is required to do? So I collected a couple of the newspaper articles that kind of emphasized this change, this kind of new revived discussion about reunification after it had a little bit of a lull. But with these newspaper articles also came that major question: is reunification still necessary? Does it still permeate South Korean society and politics and policies with North Korea? So given the KINU survey data, when asked whether a need for unification is still necessary, we saw that there is roughly a 5.1% decrease in the South Koreans' perspective of the necessity of reunification, which is huge. In 2017, where we see the lowest dip in numbers was the tension between North Korea and the US following a series of missiles and nuclear testing, which really damaged the relationship between South Koreans and North Koreans and the hopes for reunification. The importance of it is increasingly falling behind economic importance. We hear all the time that South Koreans are having a harder time finding jobs, are having a harder time in the economy, buying houses, things like that. So as South Korea kind of struggles with its economy, reunification dreams kind of fall by the wayside as reality kind of takes hold. And it's decreasing in favorability in terms of reality. So going off of that, in 2017 really sparked mistrust between North Korea and South Korea, which kind of dampens reunification hopes and aspects and dreams. So we kind of see it level off, but it still hasn't increased in plausibility or really possibility. North Korean's nuclear arsenal is a huge flashpoint in terms of reunification talks. Usually it's the negative turning point of these discussions, as we've seen throughout the years with both the United States and the DPRK, and South Korea and the DPRK. Instead, we're seeing an increase in favoritism for peaceful coexistence in South Korea. This is showcased by aid and support, in other words, economically supporting North Korea versus cooperation, working together to find a solution, is growing in favorability, again, because South Korea wants a little bit more freedom from the economic necessity of dealing with North Korea. It wants more cooperation than trying to find a means to support reunification financially. As well as peaceful coexistence goes, we generally associate that ideology with the younger generation, so usually people in their 20s, 30s, but this isn't actually necessarily the case. As we've seen from 2017, relative increase in all generations supporting this peaceful coexistence over reunification. This is mainly because as the economy struggles in South Korea a little bit, people are considering the costs of reunification more. In the past, it was more feasible to do given the fresh separation, but as years go by, South Korea's economy, it took off much faster than North Korea's, obviously. But because of the success in South Korea, it makes it harder to make reunification possible in terms of economics. In terms of coexistence, again, and compared to reunification, because a lot of the graphs show necessity or percentage, I wanted to compare coexistence to reunification directly, and the Kinyu survey data did that perfectly, emphasizing this kind of steady increase throughout the years from 2016 to 2019 of this desire for this coexistence, this cooperation, more so than reunification, which we are seeing a steady decrease in. Even this preferring rather than coming outright saying it is increasing, and it overshadows a lot of reunification sentiment. But reunification isn't solely marked by outside influences, by economics. They're also influenced by the current sitting political party. So in this case, or in this age, President Moon is of the Democratic Party of Korea, which is a more liberal political party. So we still see heavy pushings and leanings towards a desire for reunification, but it's, again, only a piece of the puzzle, so it's not entirely the makeup of the Korean people's opinion in South Korea. While reunification is still a dream of South Korea, and it will forever and always be a dream, as people long to be reunited with, make the one Korean blood on the peninsula. Separated families still struggle with the divide between the Koreas. Unfortunately, as years go by, this one nation's dream is increasingly becoming a dream rather than a possible reality. However, that doesn't mean that it's not out of the Korean people's minds 100%. So these are the sources that I used, and that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Caitlyn. Okay, Mark? Mark?
I am sharing my screen right now. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Thomas-Patterson, and my presentation is on a Republican view of Rhee, the Chicago Tribune's coverage of Syngman and Rhee from the years of 1945 to 1950. So the Chicago Tribune was a conservative newspaper of the 1940s and 1950s. And in order to understand what it viewed, it's important that we talk about American conservatism during this time period. So American conservatism was a diverse group of people and had a lot of ideas and went across party lines, but there were some figures of it, there were some elements of it that held a lot of people together, not a lot of people agreed with. One of these was anti-communism. All conservatives, regardless of what party they were affiliated in, opposed communism starting in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. In the 1930s, a lot of conservatives viewed labor unions in the United States as possible harbingers of communism, and were therefore very critical of them. Another thing that many conservatives were critical of was foreign entanglements, and they were pro-isolationist. Now, isolationist in this context does not mean conservatives wanted the United States to become a hermit kingdom. Instead, they wanted the US to avoid military involvements overseas. This is in large part due to the American experiences in the First World War, which many Americans thought was terrible afterwards and did not see a reason for the United States to get involved overseas, as they were already isolationists. The next thing we're going to talk about is the Chicago Tribune. And this is the paper that I understood. And in order to understand the Chicago Tribune, it is important that you understand. I'm sorry about this. And in order to understand the Chicago Tribune, I am there. And in order to understand the Chicago Tribune, it is important that you understand Charles McCormick, the man on the right. Charles McCormick bought the Chicago Tribune in 1920 and then turned it onto a newspaper that sought to advocate for his image of conservatism. What was this image of conservatism? Well, it was an example of Midwestern Republican conservatism. This meant that he was very much anti-communist, and he was also very pro-isolationist. He despised other foreign governments and sought to create in the United States a government that stood unique from the rest, and that was isolationist of world affairs. This is exemplified by this image, which tracks what the Chicago Tribune talked about. The Chicago Tribune hated Roosevelt and all Democrats. It also hated the British Empire and the Soviet Union, which it viewed as imperialistic foreign powers. In contrast, it criticized Hitler and Hirohito significantly less during World War II. In order to understand what the Chicago Tribune would view about the Korean Peninsula, I decided to view what the Chicago Tribune said about foreign conflicts before this in Asia. So I looked at what they said about the Chinese Civil War, and this shocked me. The Chicago Tribune acknowledged that the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 was bad and wrong. But however, it said the US should not try to support the Chinese. The Japanese, the Chicago Tribune said, were just like any other foreign power. They were imperialists and sought to take over things. Furthermore, which very much shocked me, the Chicago Tribune said that the US, as allies of France and Britain, were doing the exact same thing the Japanese did. So there's no reason for the US to support China for some particular reason if our allies were already imperialists taking things over. So with this, I had a feeling that the Chicago Tribune, going into this, the Chicago Tribune already had a strong isolationist bent. The next thing that we were going to talk about is what Syngman Rhee was doing prior to 1945. Prior to 1945, Syngman Rhee was hanging around, especially during the World War II era, was hanging around Washington, D.C. and focusing on organizing a Korean government in exile. To do this, he sought to reach out to prominent Americans and make his case for Korea. He did this by writing Korea Forgotten Nation, which the author of which would later go on to serve as his personal secretary, and as advocating for Korea as the first victim of Japanese imperialism. As shown in this cartoon here, Korea on the list of Japanese imperialism, Korea is the first name on that list, including Manchuria and other places as well. In this time period, to focus on what the Chicago Tribune said, the Chicago Tribune's coverage of Syngman Rhee can be broken into three periods. The San Francisco Conference and its aftermath in 1945, the American occupation period from 1946 to 1947, and the Korean presidential election period from 1948 to 1950. The first stage of this is the San Francisco Conference stage. In 1945, beginning of the United Nations took place in San Francisco. Here, all nations for all of the Allied net powers came and decided to get representation in this new body. Rhee and his Korean Provisional Government of Exile attended here as well, as they sought to gain representation. However, The State Department turned down their offer and they were excluded from the conference. The Chicago Tribune noticed this, as the Chicago Tribune was eager to find some story to criticize the Truman State Department with. So they interviewed Rhee, and Rhee talked about how he was striving to create a pro-American republic in Korea, and about how the Truman State Department, which was influenced by which he viewed as being influenced by the Soviet Union, was denying him his right. The Tribune loved this and had multiple exclusive interviews with Rhee. At the same time, Rhee reciprocated. Rhee also wrote letters to the Chicago Tribune, thanking them for their coverage. In this stage, we see a very mutually beneficial relationship between Rhee and the Chicago Tribune. Rhee is portrayed by the Tribune as an all-American hero who is willing to crusade against the evils of communism and of what they view as an overly communist-friendly State Department. Rhee, on the other hand, views the Tribune as a useful way to increase favorability in a region that would otherwise be not particularly favorable to his cause. The second stage of this is and these are just some examples of what Rhee was doing. So Rhee had interviews, and then he also wrote letters thanking the Tribune for its coverage. The second stage of this is what I describe as the American occupation period. And this stage is defined by the presence of a Tribune reporter named Walter Simmons in Korea. Walter Simmons traveled to Korea starting in 1947 and stayed there until 1948. And he brings back a vastly different image of Korea than the one that Rhee had advocated for previously. Simmons places a lot of emphasis on how Rhee's rule is undemocratic and compares him to a would-be autocrat. There was extensive coverage given to paramilitary activities, such as the Northwestern Youth League, and about how Rhee uses undemocratic methods to attack his opponents. Most notably, another interesting part is that Colonel Robert McCormick, the owner of the Tribune, travels to Japan to see his good friend General Douglas MacArthur, and then also to Korea. When in Korea, he then writes a report about this. In this report, he says, we need to leave Korea once we set up a democracy. He acknowledges that yes, if the United States forces leave Korea, Soviet troops can come down through the north and take it over. However, he says that this is just something necessary that the U.S. needs to do. So with this, we see a new isolationist stage of the Tribune, and one that's very critical of Rhee, but also entirely willing to leave Korea. And the final stage is what I describe as the presidential election stage. This starts in 1948 as Rhee begins to run for the presidency of South Korea. Here, the coverage shifts once again. This is also due to the fact that Walter Simmons has left the peninsula. And Rhee's portrayed as a pro-American hero. He's portrayed as fighting to create a strong anti-communist state in a region that's not too friendly to U.S. interests. During this time period, there was also a minimum of activity. There was a very little discussion about activities brought on by the Northwestern Youth League or other paramilitary groups. And if there is, their actions are generally viewed as just, that they are required in order to fight off communist interference. This relationship between the Tribune and Rhee is cemented when Douglas MacArthur commends Rhee for his role in leading North Korea. This shout out from MacArthur is especially important for the Tribune, as MacArthur was viewed by many of the Tribune's readership as a patriotic American hero who is different from the Truman administration and Democrats. With MacArthur's endorsement, Rhee gets the endorsement as a full-blooded anti-communist, pro-American leader on the world stage. Interestingly enough, I stopped this research in 1950. Once the Korean War starts, there is a marked decrease in coverage of Rhee. I presume this is in large part due to the fact that Tribune reporters were spent much more time focused on the war effort itself and significantly less on Korean domestic politics. In conclusion, the Chicago Tribune's coverage of Rhee shows a movement at a tipping point. Rhee is portrayed as both a hero of American values and as a right-wing demagogue over a series of just 5 years. This shows a movement which is split between advocating for the fighting communism abroad, but also bringing its troops back home and making sure that they can put America first. In the end, the Chicago Tribune embraces Rhee, and this sets a symbol for American conservative support of Korea and other authoritarian anti-communist regimes throughout the rest of the Cold War. Question.
Okay, thank you, Mark. People, you can come back, and we have about 8 minutes for questions, both Caitlyn and Mark.
A question for Caitlyn. I wondered if you had gone back further in your research. I know you were just presenting a small slice of time, but when you were doing your work, did you go back earlier to see, after German unification, for example, there was a lot of concern in Korea about the costs that would be incurred, and given the size of the South Korean economy, and so there was a dip in pro-unification sentiment, and then the more conservative political leaders have ratcheted up anti-North Korea sentiment in order to, solidify their blocks. Did you go back further?
Yes, actually I did. So that was kind of the section that I chose to do was more modern because it's more of a marked shift that we're seeing. However, around the 1960s, there was a decrease in reunification sentiment. However, it was more based upon ideological differences rather than strong influences from German reunification. South Korea has always been more in favor of reunification despite economics at times, given policies of current administrations. The past slide showed the sharp shift in conservative parties' ideology towards coexistence, and that's kind of emphasized by their continuing or their past continuance of desiring reunification, but it changed again in 2017 drastically because of North Korea's increase in missiles and nukes, and ever since North Korea acquired their nuclear arsenal, reunification has kind of taken a nosedive in South Korea because it's increasingly becoming impossible for them to separate North Korea from their nuclear arsenal. So that's why I chose to do the 2016 to 2019 rather than go all the way back. So I hope that answers your question.
Any other question for Caitlyn or Mark?
Can I ask a question to Mark?
Yes.
Mark, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm curious because I thought your research was very suggestive, but I'm curious to hear you do something that sometimes historians, speaking as a historian, are loath to do, which is zoom out a little bit and sort of see sort of what larger conclusions might be drawn sort of from this case study. And I was curious in particular how you see your work fitting alongside sort of the history of conservative realignment in America in the late 40s. There's this sort of narrative that conservative politics becomes much more amenable to foreign engagement and large defense spending after the outbreak of the Korean War. And your research seems somewhat in dialogue with this, although you're suggesting a slightly different timeline. So I was curious sort of how you see your work engaging with this larger sort of political history in America at the end of the 1940s. And what do you see as the relationship of this paper to conservatism at large in America?
That's an excellent question. And I think my paper touches on a lot of things with the realignment, one of which is a new relationship with East Asia and with conservatives' views of East Asia. Prior to that, there have been a lot of racist paternalism. And with this relationship with Rhee, and especially due to Rhee's time at Princeton, time in GW, time in DC, I think a lot of conservatives view Rhee as an acceptable figure to have as an acceptable person to have in East Asia. And I feel like for him, he's in many ways, he's somebody that they can very much understand and agree with. And I think the interesting thing about my research is that even before the Korean War, there were conservatives who were interested in Rhee, interested in combating communism. Yes, it was less concrete, but I think it shows that even before, history's nuanced, and even the Korean War it wasn't just before the Korean War everybody was against being abroad, and then after the Korean War everybody was for it. No, before the Korean War, when people were aware of the Soviet threat, there was a lot of debates within the conservative movement, and especially within what I find particularly interesting is even within the Midwestern conservative movement, of which the Tribune was one of the foremost spokespeople. There were people in the Chicago Tribune who were saying the United States needs to support South Korea in 1945 and 1946. This is not something 8 years earlier when they were talking about China, they would never have said this. So I think it does signify that, yeah, before, even in the immediate post-war period, the conservative movement was already thinking about things, and that's just a preview of what is to come later on. So I hope, did that answer your question?
Yes, great. Thank you so much.
Just to follow up on that, both of the presentations were really interesting. Thank you. But Mark, I had a question for you, wondering why did you choose the Midwest region and Chicago in particular to focus on?
So I'm really interested in the intersection of politics, domestic politics, and foreign policy. And the Chicago Tribune is interesting because it was a newspaper that was renowned for its isolationism. It became the butt of jokes because it was regarded as this most unreliable paper in the United States. It shared that title with the Communist Party's Daily Worker. And it very much said, everybody outside the US is bad. The US needs to stay isolated. But then I was like, it also really hated communism. And it was famous for this. And I was wondering, how does it square these two things when talking about Korea? And for me, and then also when you're studying conservatism in this time period, there aren't that many like prominent conservative publications. Those get started up later as you get into the 50s and 60s. So I was like, how can I view a movement that is influential but doesn't really have a voice? And through research, the Chicago Tribune was really a prime example of that.
Okay, both Caitlyn and Mark, thank you so much. We are going to take 10-minute break and come back here by 2:50.